welcome to another episode of In Focus brought to you by the Uongozi Institute. I'm your host, Gwamaka Kifukwe. Joining us on today's program is Dr. Peter Eigen to discuss the importance of governance in the extractive industries sector. Dr. Eigen is the founder and chairman of the Advisory Council for Transparency International. He's also the founding chairman of the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative and a member of the Africa Progress Panel. Dr. Eigen, welcome to the program.
It's a great pleasure to be here.
I just want to start off by sort of getting the story for what led you to establish Transparency International.
Well, I must say I didn't really think of establishing an organization. I was interested in fighting corruption. At that time, I was still the director of the regional office of the World Bank in Nairobi, and I noticed that many of the projects which were implemented in Kenya and the other surrounding countries were failing because of large-scale corruption. I saw that the wrong projects have been selected. I saw that money disappeared. I saw that projects were over-designed. In fact, I noticed that there was sort of an unholy alliance between suppliers from the north, from Germany, from the UK, from Japan, from France, from Canada, and local decision makers who designed projects in accordance with the opportunities of collecting bribes rather than the usefulness of these projects for the people in the countries where we are trying to do development. And so in 1993, we could set up in Berlin this little not-for-profit organization, Transparency International. And I'm very proud that I did it, but I never expected it to become such a powerful organization.
And I mean, corruption itself and sort of broadly speaking governance has now become a very topical discussion. But is it something that is actually improving across the world? I mean, given that last year we saw in the Transparency International Index that 69% of the countries surveyed actually scored less than 50, which is, well, sorry, is it more than 50, I believe, where they're not doing very well, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa and in Eastern Europe and Central Asia. So is governance and corruption as well, are these problems getting worse or are there improvements?
I get this question very often. For instance, in Germany right now, we have about 120 companies which are being prosecuted for bribing outside Germany. So people say, is there now more corruption of German companies? These cases, these 120 cases against some of the most prestigious companies of the world, whether it's MAN, whether it's Ferrostahl, whether it's Siemens, whether it's Daimler, nobody would even talk about them if we wouldn't exist, if we wouldn't have been able to change the legal system in Germany, which makes it a crime to bribe outside Germany. In the United States, you had the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act since 1977. And therefore, Americans always knew that they are not allowed to bribe outside the United States. But in Germany, or in France, or in the UK, not only were these companies allowed to bribe outside their borders, they were even supported and subsidized and rewarded for doing it. I mean, in Germany, for instance, you could deduct your bribes paid from your taxable income. So if you paid $1 million to President Moi to get an over-designed project, which the Kenyan society didn't need, you could deduct this from your taxable income, and therefore most of the American companies, the German companies, they did it. Not all of them. There are some companies who never bribed. But most of the companies said this is legal, this is our tax system, even subsidizes it. Our export financing agencies, like Hermes, they look the other way if there's corruption. So why should we not do what everybody else is doing? And the same system, of course, we had in many other countries. So that right now in Germany, you have 120 cases, with even criminal sanctions and with damage suits against the management if they have bribed in the past. is fantastic, and it shows that the situation is getting much better. Now, when it comes to the bird of the hand that takes the money or demands the money, when you come to Africa, to Latin America and Asia, in my opinion, the awareness of the people, the awareness of civil society, the awareness of the media, the awareness of the politicians in the parliaments that corruption is deadly, is destructive in their society, is really grown. And therefore, they are much less patient. They are getting much more angry about corruption of their leaders. And therefore, you talk about it more, the media talk about it more, you get more prosecutions. And therefore, I personally feel that the situation is much better than it was 20 years ago when we started. But I must say, we still have a long way to go. There are many people who invent new ways of bribing. They invent new structures of hiding the corporate identity of the beneficial owners of certain accounts and so on. Therefore, the fight against corruption is becoming more and more complex. But if you now listen to people like, say, Kofi Annan in his last report of the Africa Progress Panel, if you listen to Kaberuka, you know, the head of the African Development Bank, if you listen to the head of the World Bank, Mr. Kim, if you listen to the people from the United Nations institutions, everybody talks about the need to improve governance. And of course, nowhere is governance as important as in the area of extractive industries.
And I'm glad you brought up extractive industries. I want to ask you, are there governance challenges that are unique to extractive industries that makes them, you know, that much more important or different or so forth?
Well, I mean, this is a huge subject. I mean, the Dutch already noticed that it is unique to the development of oil and gas in the North Sea that the economy tends to be distorted, that currencies tend to be overvalued, that other sectors of the economy tend to be neglected and tend to atrophy. That is called the Dutch disease. You know, this is a very unique thing which you find in most countries which have a sudden inflow in one particular sector. But when it comes to corruption, it is also, in my opinion, quite unique, the temptation and the vulnerability of the sector to bribery. Because the amounts of money you are talking about are totally out of proportion to everything else which is happening in the country. I remember when we worked in Botswana about 40 years ago and we discovered the Shashi project, the copper-nickel project, or the diamond project, or other extractive industries projects. At that time, the amounts of money which were coming into the region, into Shashi, for instance, hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars, were so out of proportion with the rest of the economy that the temptation of the leadership there to take some of this money and take the wrong decisions, somehow decisions which would be comfortable, for instance, to the investors, was great. But in Botswana, they resisted. You know, in Botswana, there was a leadership which was extremely modest, moderate, professional. I don't know what the reason is. The leadership of Seretse Khama, of course, played a great role. And therefore, the idea for a foreign investor who has to create stability and predictability of the enabling environment for this investment is extremely important. And if he can find some people in the government whose friendship and whose partnership, whose conspiracy can be established through a few benefits, you know, and of course, when we are talking about bribery in this context, about grant corruption, we are not talking about $500,000 or so, or about $5 million, which are being paid into Swiss bank accounts of the local decision makers. If this can be done, it is a great temptation for the promoters of this kind of business. And it's a great temptation for the leaders in some of these countries, which are very often not very well paid, even at ministerial level. They don't have any stability. They don't have the capacity to send their children to good universities. So for them to suddenly get an offer like that, is a great temptation. To build safeguards against this is therefore particularly important. And this is why we at Transparency International, when we recognized how difficult it would be to make a difference in the extractive industries, we joined with great enthusiasm this Publish What You Pay initiative, which is a very modest initiative. It was simply asking companies to publish what they pay in taxes, in royalties, in dividends, in signature bonuses, and other payments to the local government. Because to the great surprise of most people, these payments are confidential in most countries. I remember I had a conversation with Ahidjo at one point when he was the president of Cameroon. And he said, I have to keep this secret even from my own ministers, because my ministers are greedy. They want to get hold of that money. So I said to him, yeah, but Mr. President, what do they want that money for? And he said, oh, they want to build roads, they want to build hospitals, they want to build schools. So I said, well, this is exactly what this money is for. And he said, oh, you don't understand. At that time, I was still with the World Bank. The World Bankers don't understand. It's sort of Western mind. Africa is different. So I have to keep this confidential. So this is the reason why everybody says nowadays, governance is the issue. If you have a way of holding your power elite accountable to how they structure these extractive industry deals, then you can make sure that the money is used in a way which helps the people, because they are, after all, the owners of these natural resources. But as you know from the very important work which Uongozi is doing, it is not only the sharing of the money which is so important in extractive industries. There are many other aspects which a good mining venture, for instance, has to deal with.
But I mean, in the context of Africa itself, many of these countries, are poor. A lot of them don't have the experience of dealing with natural resources until, the reality suddenly hits them. I mean, what chance do they really have to take on essentially a global, not industry, but a global network or global grouping of people who are used to doing these kinds of things? I mean, how can a country like Tanzania or any other country, combat these or prevent these or hamper them? Like, what can be done from that kind of perspective?
Well, I mean, there are two dimensions to the answer to your question. I mean, one is the dimension of what can we do to make sure that a continent like Africa gets a fair share of the benefits of globalization, gets a fair share of the decision-making about the globalized economy, and how one can make sure that there is a modicum of legitimacy in the governance for the globalized economy. When I feel personally that it's not only the Africans who are victims of poor global governance. In my opinion, it's also the governments of the North who are victims of poor global governance. I mean, look at Germany. When until 1999, they allowed their companies to bribe outside Germany. When we talked to the ministers in Germany about it, when we talked to the academia, to the civil society and so on about it, they said, well, we have to, because everybody else is doing. There is no global governance. So when we go out to China to get contracts, or to Nigeria, or to Russia, or to Poland, or somewhere, we have to do what everybody else is doing. So they were as much the victims of poor global governance as the poor governments in Africa, even though the governments of poor countries in Africa are even more the victims.
Sure, yeah.
And collective action, in my opinion, is sort of the magic word. You know, you have to find a way that everybody simultaneously, on a level playing field, raises standard of good governance, so that you don't suffer from your own responsible behavior.
Yeah,
I mean, this is a typical sort of prisoner's dilemma in which people find themselves. And the same thing is true with the huge companies. I mean, big companies like Exxon or Shell or Anglo-American or Vale or so, they are also victims of poor global governance. So this is why I remember when I came a lot to Tanzania in the late 60s, early 70s. It was Arthur D. Little who had helped to develop a system which they called the New Economic Order. You know, they talked about the permanent sovereignty of African states over their natural resources. This was an attempt already to create a global governance which would allow African governments to play a more powerful role. A UN Center for Transnational Corporations was created at the UN to help African governments to, and other developing country governments to strengthen their negotiation capacity. Because if a company comes and it discovers oil or copper or gold in your territory, you can set the conditions under which you allow them to develop these minerals. And therefore there is a very strong leverage of a national government to impose a legal system which is useful for all sides. But the UN Center for Transnational Corporations was perverted in its role at some point after the second oil crisis. It was dissolved. You know, the people who were doing very good work there were distributed between various UN secretariats and UNCTAD. And so many of these efforts are already 40, 50 years old, you know. And in fact, Mwalimu Nyerere was one of the spokesmen of a rational attempt of Africa to take these things into its hands, you know. And yet, we are still faced with the same problem. And therefore, I think we all have to find a new paradigm of governance. We have to recognize that the nation state as a decisive building block for global governance is failing. The nation state does not have the global reach which is needed in order to regulate global companies. The nation state does not have the time horizon. I mean, even the most democratic government, they have a time horizon of 3, 4, 5 years, you know, when politicians have to again cater to the interest of their own voters, while most of the problems of the globalized economy have a much longer time horizon. I mean, if you think of climate change, for instance, and human rights violations and things like this. But also the nation state has to serve a very dispersed and differentiated constituency. So it is quite clear that, say, a German politician who wants to be elected again, he cannot basically cater to a global constituency in order to deal with global poverty and so on, because the farmers in Bavaria will not vote for him, you know, if he does this, or the farmers in France for a French politician and so on. With other words, there are built-in difficulties of developing global governance based on the sovereign nation-state government. And therefore, our experiences with Transparency International, but also with the Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative and a number of other similar initiatives, we need organized civil society to get involved. If they get involved, not to replace governments or not to compete with governments, but in a sort of triangular cooperation. I mean, some people call it an antagonistic cooperation, where each one retains their own independence. Then things can be changed. in a very general sense, to get better global governance, to get fairer global governance, to get a long-term vision in improving global governance, you need a new paradigm of governance which includes a powerful, well-educated, well-informed, very professional and accountable civil society organization at each level. And more generally, of course, I think it is very important that governments take a holistic approach, that they understand that a mining investment is not only about how you share the benefits. This is an important issue, in particular for a poor country, and I think it's good that Tanzania can look forward to an increase of benefits and revenues from mining and from gas development. But in my opinion, this is not the most important one. It is very important to manage it well. It is important, for instance, to make sure that you don't have the Dutch disease by neutralizing some of these additional funds in the economy. And therefore, for instance, what the Norwegians are doing with their funds to siphon off this excess liquidity and keep it for future generations is, in my opinion, a very, very good example. But it cannot be applied as such in every country, in particular in a country like Tanzania, which has some very, very urgent investment needs. So there one simply has to make sure that the money is properly used, you know. Hopefully this triangular cooperation of government, civil society and private sector can do the diagnosis and can develop ideas on proper use of the money to have a developmental impact. The same thing is happening in Mozambique. You know, there are 2 corridors from the big Vale coal deposits out to the ports in the Indian Ocean. These corridors have to be designed with the mandate to make it useful to everybody, and not only to the company, because whatever the company pays on this, and very often these are hundreds of millions of dollars, will be indirectly paid by the government because they can deduct it from their taxable income. So very often it is true that the companies have to pay hundreds of millions of dollars to build ports and railways and so on. But indirectly, of course, the government pays because they can deduct it from their taxable income. And the government, therefore, gets nothing, you know, or very little. So, I mean, infrastructure, extremely important. Human development, you know. Youth unemployment is one of the great issues in Africa. So what can the mining sector do to contribute to this? Most mining investors are not labor intensive. And therefore the idea for, instead of buying a big machine, give everybody a shovel and a wheelbarrow and so on would be total nonsense. You know? Therefore you have to simply accept that there will not be much employment in the mine itself. But there will be a lot of possibilities of supplying to the mines, a lot of possibility of allowing, for instance, the mine workers to live not too far away from the mine, but in a fertile area where they can have, for instance, access to agriculture and so on, and other secondary linkages. In particular, also to work for diversification in the economy, because you don't want to lose the activities and the opportunities which are outside the mining sector. Therefore, sometimes I'm critical of the idea of focusing mainly on added value in the mining development chain, you know, because that makes you even more dependent on the fate of copper or of gold and so on the international market if you totally focus on your added value chain. And these are, of course, all things which have been thought through very, very carefully under the leadership of Paul Collier in Oxford. And therefore, I'm a great fan of the Natural Resource Charter. Not as a prescription to countries, because they have no power, you know, they have no cannon boats to force anybody to do it. But it's a conceptual framework, you know. And if you have smart people in a country, they can take that and say, how is our system working? What are we doing on infrastructure? How do we protect our environment? have you thought really of what happens when the mine closes? You know, the government has to make sure that they maintain the control over these developmental issues in a holistic sense, and it is for me quite clear for that you need good governance. You know? And in that sense, I'm really very happy that here in Tanzania, again I should say, because I remember Tanzania from 40 years ago. Again, Tanzania is taking the lead and taking this conceptual framework in its hands and using it through your institute to create a benchmarking exercise which can be helpful to the government to do the right things.
What message would you give to African leaders and Africans generally concerning sort of governance of extractives, especially now that so much attention has come to Africa over this issue? Like what message would you really like to get across to them?
Well, I feel one of the most important things is good governance and accountability, which comes with checks and balances in a society. It comes sometimes with elections, but the most important thing is the rule of law, you know, the independence of the judiciary, checks and balances of institutions. If you have this, then you get the trust of the people, and you will get the trust also of foreign investors, and you get a chance to develop an area of common interest between investor and the nation in order to create an enabling environment for mining, which has to balance the interest of the investor. They have to have some stability. They have to have some predictability, but they shouldn't overdo it. There has to be some flexibility. There has to be some capacity to adapt long-term contracts to changing circumstances, not through breach of contracts, not through default and so on, but through occasional renegotiation. But to reach this kind of balance, I think you need good governance. And good governance starts with transparency. It goes through accountability, and it goes through a powerful role of civil society. Make them your trusted partners, but also critiques. Goes through trusted institutions, parliaments, laws, rule of law. And I think if we can move into this direction, Africa is rich, you know, in particular if it can pursue this idea which the World Bank has put forward of a major effort of exploring the natural resources of Africa, because Africa doesn't really know what it has yet. It's probably the most underexplored continent of the world. And therefore, if one can, based on this knowledge, move into an area of better governance, I think we can look forward to a very positive development of Africa.
Well, and on that note, thank you very much for joining us in the program, and welcome back anytime.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. Yeah.
And thank you at home for joining us, and we hope you enjoyed the program. We hope to see you again soon on another interview brought to you by the Uongozi Institute. Goodbye.
Yes, there are always life. There are lessons to be learned for the earlier life of someone who just want to lead a nation or a society. I was sort of orphan. My father died when I was 10, and my mother brought me up. And then it was the Somali government, the state, that brought me up. I have been studied from elementary school to the university to make master's degree, all through a free education, all of them. When I finished secondary school, I was given scholarship to the Somali National University. When I finished that university, I was given a guaranteed employment. I was immediately employed. The day I graduated, the day I started working, there was only 10 days in between. And then By working a couple of years, then I was given scholarship, master's degree to outside world, given by my government. So that makes